Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.
Greetings and welcome to season 12 of Left to Black. My name is Mark Anthony Neal, longtime host, and we are joined today by Professor Jarvis R. Givens, assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a faculty affiliate in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard. And he is the author of Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, which was published in 2021 by Harvard University Press. Of Fugitive Pedagogy, Henry Giroux writes, "It is a brilliant, inspiring, and an energizing book that reclaims the narratives of critique and hope that fueled the deep grammar of pedagogical struggle that unfolded in both the experiences and narratives of Black educators in the beginning of the 20th century and beyond." Welcome to Left to Black, Professor Givens.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. This is a really amazing book. I know for me, from my own personal reading of it, it really does recover Carter G. Woodson as a radical figure. You know, there are ways in which, the image of Carter G. Woodson has been flattened over the years, and we just simply think about him in the context of being the father of Black History Month and Negro History Week, and everybody talks about, the miseducation of the Negro, but you really unfold a really compelling figure and give us, much deeper context for the scholar that he became and the radical figure that he became. But you start the book not with Carter G. Woodson, but this figure of Tessie McGee, who you describe in the beginning of the book and throughout as really a great example of what you call fugitive teaching. Talk a little bit about who Tessie McGee was.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. Tessie McGee was a teacher at the Webster Parish Training School. And the opening scenario of the book that you're referring to is taking place in the early 1930s, where Tessie McGee is secretly reading to her high school class of students at the Webster Parish Training School from Carter G. Woodson's textbook that she keeps concealed in her lap underneath the desk. And then the student recalls someone coming into the classroom, and he says she stopped reading from the book and began reading from the required outline that she was supposed to teach from based on the local kind of school board. And then the student says when the door closes and the person leaves, her eyes went back to the book in her lap. For me, that was, when I came across that story, it really opened my eyes to the extraordinary work that ordinary Black teachers were doing in Black schools across this country. And that to understand the significance of Carter G. Woodson, we also had to understand this world of Black teachers that he was a part of, right? That he was a student, because he himself had once been a student in, rural Black classrooms in Virginia being taught by his formerly enslaved uncles. And that story about Tessie McGee just forced me to imagine a new way of talking about the way Black teachers navigated power in the context of Jim Crow schools. And Tessie McGee just became the perfect embodiment of that. And I wanted to open the book with her telling that story because Woodson is also present in the context of his textbook that she's using. But in order to really appreciate that story, we have to take into account the social history that gave it meaning, right? And so using Tessie McGee as this kind of window to kind of open the story became very important for me because it wasn't just about Woodson. It was about this pedagogical tradition he was the product of and that he helped to expand through his work.
One of the things I love about the story of McGee is that it even isn't just what she's doing pedagogically in that moment, right? But she's offering the students in the class a blueprint, a narrative, right, for the ways in which they have to negotiate, their own sense of Black study and the white gaze, right? I mean, she's literally, performing that labor for them, right? In ways that you could imagine that those of them that were really attuned to it, right, could take it and then apply it to their own work, going forward.
Absolutely. And I so appreciate you for lifting up that point, because for me, it's not just about the text that she's reading. It's not just the kind of these alternative scripts of knowledge that Woodson is offering through his textbook, The Negro in Our History, but it's also this embodied practice that we see in Tessie McGee that actually is important for understanding how Black people even began to develop this kind of counter-intellectual tradition, right? This intellectual tradition where they're reclaiming the stories of Black resistance, and the stories of fugitive slaves in the period of enslavement, or the history of Black people secretly learning to read and write. That's literally documented in the book that she's secretly reading to her students from, right? And so that embodiment is also communicating important lessons to the students, right? So it's not just about the written word, but it's also about the kind of the embodied knowledge that we see in how Tessie McGee is navigating the constraints of Jim Crow schools. And students are taking lessons from this, which is why I emphasize the point that we only get access to this story because her student remembered this, right?
Yeah.
That left some account of it in the record for someone like myself to go back and to study, and to use that as a way of kind of challenging so much of the kind of so many of the flat narratives that we tend to have about Black teachers and Black education prior to desegregation.
There's a way in this contemporary moment when we think about the relationship to Black academics, to Black teachers, right? And there's so many well-funded workshops and webinars now where, Black faculty, engage secondary and high school teachers, elementary school teachers on how to teach Black history. To the extent that there's a real strong dichotomy between what we think of as working teachers, Black teachers every day, and Black, scholars and intellectuals and what have you. Carter G. Woodson didn't have the luxury, right, to really build upon that kind of dichotomy, right? He saw his lot, obviously, because he was coming up as a school teacher himself, but he saw his own intellectual development as intricately connected to the world of Black teachers. And part of that is embodied in the way that he ran what we now call ASALH, but the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, where he always imagined that institution as not just being about a place for Black scholars to come together, but really, a real vertical exchange of ideas, right, among teachers, among students, and obviously faculty and other folks who were teaching at HBCUs at the time.
Absolutely. And that's really one of the things that was so inspiring to me when I was trying to recover these different aspects of Carter G. Woodson's story. And I just felt like I had to lift up the fact that there was not this clear divide between the intellectual work and demands placed on the Black scholar in higher education and the intellectual work and demands of Black school teachers. And this is just, it's illuminated in Carter G. Woodson's personal narrative. When we think about the years leading up to him founding ASALH, he's a teacher at the M Street School in Washington, D.C., where his colleagues are people like Anna Julia Cooper, right? Mm-hmm. And Jesse Fawcett, and so many other faculty members that are there that have advanced degrees, who have traveled around the world, and other teachers in Washington, D.C., like Lila Amos Pendleton, who wrote a textbook before he wrote a textbook, right? And similar, and as well as John Cromwell, who was also a principal in the DC public schools. And so one of the things that I wanted to show was that we have to make sure that in appreciating this institution that Woodson created was that it didn't occur in a vacuum. Woodson was a part of this intellectual world of Black teachers where they're engaging in deep intellectual struggle. Literally the months leading up to him founding ASALH or the ASNLH in Chicago, one of the things I tried to document are these debates that are happening amongst the teachers at the school that he attends and also in DC public schools more broadly, but also in places like, other organizations that he's a part of, like the American Negro Academy, with Arturo Schomburg speaking to a group of teachers literally just a year and a half before he founds ASALH, saying that we need chairs of Negro history in our schools. We need people to come forward and to write new textbooks, to speak to the experiences of Black scholars and Black students. And then in Washington, D.C., before Woodson even travels to Chicago, where he founds the ASNLH in that September, you have the teachers saying that they're planning to host professional development seminars that fall, where they're bringing W.B. Du Bois is doing kind of professional development workshops on outlines and sketches in Negro history for high school history teachers, and where Woodson himself is participating in this work, right? And so we have to understand the founding of this organization that we tend to think of as just for university trained historians, as actually something that's about a much larger educational project, because Woodson himself, even as he had already had a PhD in history, was not able to teach at institutions of higher education during this time period. He himself is a teacher in a high school, right? And so we see this collapsing of these rigid boundaries between higher education and the K through 12 setting, because these are educators that understand their work as engaging in a much larger shared project about challenging Blackness in society. And these teachers are saying that they have to also engage in intellectual struggle in order to meet the needs of their students, because the curriculum, the policies and protocols of the dominant American school are insufficient for meeting the demands of their work as Black teachers for Black students.
Years from now, when folks look back on your work and in this book in particular, the thing that's going to resonate for folks is this language of fugitive pedagogy. Can you unpack a little bit for our audience this idea of fugitive pedagogy?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I should say that I didn't start out with that kind of idea. I really, that concept of fugitive pedagogy came from me trying to figure out how to name what I saw taking place in these encounters, like the one I shared about Tessie McGee.
Yeah, I know, because you say at some point in the book, it wasn't just resistance, right? There was something else that was going on than just simply describing it as a resistance, to American education and American schooling. Right.
Yeah, and part of resistance is, it's accurate, but it's insufficient to fully capture the dynamics and the power dynamics that are at play in these stories that I was trying to write about with Black teeth. And so one of the things that became instructive for me, I should also say, I was very, very fascinated with the history of subversive Black educational politics in the time of slavery. And, the fact that anti-literacy laws, predate the founding of the United States, right? The first anti-literacy law is established in 1740 that makes Black literacy, that criminalizes Black literacy in the context of South Carolina in response to the Stono Slave Rebellion of 1739. So you have this deep structural antagonism surrounding Black education that even precedes the founding of the United States. But then we see these anti-literacy laws proliferating in various states across the South. And even in the absence of anti-literacy laws, there's this kind of ambient anti-literacy ideology and sentiment cuts across regional boundaries in the North and the South, leading up to the Civil War. And so in this context, we see Black people developing an educational project that refuses the criminalization of Black literacy and Black education. And that is a politics of education that is developed by enslaved people and their fugitive literacy practices. Frederick Douglass is one of the iconic examples of this, right? When Master Hugh Ault says to his wife, if you teach this slave how to read and write, it'll make him discontent. It'll unfit him for his duty. He says, this being accomplished, he'll be running away with himself, right? It's literally the quote that Douglass recalls from Master Hugh Ault when he links Douglass's efforts to become a literate subject with Douglass's the potential for him to disrupt the political economy of slavery and to run away physically in his body, but also the kind of intellectual work and the expression of Douglass's own interiority, chipped away at the kind of power dynamics of slavery as well. And so what I'm trying to name in the book is saying that there's a relationship between that politics of education developed by enslaved people and the politics expressed by Black folks in the post-emancipation era, when their education is technically legal, right? It's no longer illegal, but we know that it's continued to be met with violent white resistance, even as the freed men and women are the people who lead the legislative campaigns to establish the first universal education system in the Southern states, right? But their education continues to be under violent assault. You know, between 1866 and 1876, more than 600 Black schools are burned down in the South. Yeah. So given that violent context of surveillance, we know that critical parts of Black education continue to happen through subversive and fugitive means, right? Because there continue to be these efforts to restrain and to restrict what the form that Black education would take and how it would be used to challenge the kind of the social hierarchy of the post-bellum context. And so fugitive pedagogy it indexes that history of the fugitive literacy of enslaved people. It indexes that close linking of Black literacy with with fugitive slaves. I think of Ishmael Reed's book Flight to Canada when he says, it's a fictional narrative, but it's really building on this history when he says the first to learn to read on the plantation was often the first to run away, right? This is, referring to Master Huard saying the thing, that there's a relationship between these things. We can read some of the fugitive slave ads that will oftentimes list the fact that these fugitive slaves, it's suspected that they might be literate, right? And they might have a forged past alongside physical descriptions of scars on their faces and how tall they were, right. Or missing kind of limbs, so on and so forth. And so that history of Black fugitive life and Black educational life that develops in the time of slavery is something that continues to persist when we see teachers secretly learning to read and write. Teachers secretly exposing students to this counter-intellectual tradition and teaching about fugitive slaves, right? Carter G. Woodson attended a high school where his cousin was the principal, and it was named after Frederick Douglass, right? So we see Black people commemorating the history of Black fugitive life, right? Not only that, but we see the spirit of Black fugitive life embodied in the work that teachers are doing. That same principal at Carter G. Woodson's high school, the Frederick Douglass High School, was his first cousin who was fired from that school because of his political advocacy in that local community in Huntington, West Virginia, by operating an independent Black newspaper where he's organizing the local Black community around electoral politics, right? He loses his job because of that, right? So I'm saying that the intellectual work of enslaved people who were pursuing literacy through fugitive means is connected to this counter-educational tradition that's reflected in both the scripts of knowledge that they're writing, right? I also named the fact that the very first Black author textbooks were written by fugitive slaves, right? That are related to also the slave narratives, which is the foundation of the kind of Black educational and intellectual tradition in this country, right? Is literature that's produced by fugitive slaves, right? This literary tradition, this educational tradition, is not unrelated from Carter G. Woodson's writing of textbooks that are reclaiming these people as heroes, right? As a part of an intellectual tradition that students can look to as for inspiration and to help them develop an incisive social analysis about their condition, Black learners in an anti-Black world.
Yeah, I got to tell you, when you talk about, fugitive slaves as these kind of educational folk heroes, and I remember, being excited about reading that part of the book, and you start with Frederick Douglass, right? And I had to pause because there's a way in which his image has been so sanitized over the years that we forget that he was a fugitive slave. right. And in many, because we talk about Nat Turner and folks like that, but that's also the world that produced Frederick Douglass. And how many hundreds, right? Probably thousands of Frederick Douglass schools are literally across the United States right now.
Right. It's so true. And to think about, that's a practice that the formerly enslaved people and Black folks during Jim Crow were naming schools after Frederick Douglass. There's also, I think about also after Toussaint Louverture, right? One of the things I had to emphasize, is a number of schools that were actually named after Toussaint, right? In terms of thinking about how the Haitian Revolution was also a part of these narratives of Black fugitive life that Black teachers were handing over and sharing and saying, this is important for you to understand your condition and this continuum of consciousness that you should understand yourself as being situated within, right? And your work is an extension of this tradition, is essentially what they're doing. It's not just about learning the facts of Negro history, the first Black person to do this, the kind of first independent Black nation. It's about these teachers, they were offering this and trying to expand the inventory of knowledge of students, but there was also a conceptual kind of claim that they're making in putting this information before students and trying to offer it as resources for them to interpret their reality in a Jim Crow world.
I want to return a moment to Woodson. You know, he found the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, you know, more than 15 years before the publication of The Miseducation. He gets his, you know, PhD at least a decade before The Miseducation of the Negro. I think we're apt to forget that he had such an impactful career in life before the publication of that book, right, which is published, you know, 15 or so years before his death. But I want to go back to an earlier example of Woodson's work when he's working in the coal mines. And you know, this story just, you know, had me on fire. The idea he's working in the coal mines, and at the behest of the Black men who are working in the coal mines, he sets up a study group, right, where he's reading to them Black texts amongst men who can't read, but still engaged in the discourse of critical discourse of intellectual attainment in the context. I mean, it's just absolutely fascinating. And it's a model I think that we need to revisit in terms of creating sectors of Black study in working class communities, you know, in ways in which, you know, Woodson didn't just see himself as an expert in this context, but part of a community of interlocutors, right? Even though he was the one who had literacy in a traditional sense, and these men didn't.
Absolutely. I think for me that that was such an important part of Woodson's biography, you know, and so the book is not trying to offer an exhaustive biography of Woodson's life, but I found it to be important to pick apart these important elements of his own personal narrative and his journey from being a student, the student of and child of former slaves, right? He's both the student and the child of former slaves. But then he also essentially becomes a teacher in many ways of formerly enslaved people as well, because these Civil War veterans were also formerly enslaved, Black who were also illiterate. And it's in that space that he becomes exposed to the knowledge and the knowledge that these people carry, right? That, you know, gave him the kind of courage to refuse the idea presented by his Harvard University professors who said, Black people have no history, or at least none worthy of respect, right? It's because he heard the stories from his mother of being in a coffle of slaves sold in front of the statue of George Washington in Richmond, Virginia, and how the enslaved people came to associate that symbol of George Washington with them being sold down south, right? And so these ideas, these kind of these alternative claims on knowledge and on the American project that he inherits from his parents, right? Because his father also relies on him. His father is illiterate and relies on him to read newspapers to him as well. So this practice of communal literacy, right, is a model of education that was a core part of Black subversive practices around education during the period of enslavement, such that even those people who were not able to decipher the written word could rely on people who were literate to read in their hearing excerpts from newspapers or pieces of abolitionist literature, right? For them to then interact with literate culture as well. This is something that carries over to the post-emancipation period. And so these men who Woodson is working with in the coal mines invite him to come into their parlor in the evening, and they give him things essentially to pay him to read to them from Black newspapers, from mainstream papers, from some of the kind of early books that are being written by Black scholars in the late 19th century. And this is before he even attends high school, right? He hasn't attended high school at this point. Woodson is not able to attend high school until he moves away to Huntington, Virginia, to attend a school where his family is a part of this school community at the age of 20, right? So all the stuff is what he experiences before he starts high school at the age of 20 years old. And that is central to the vision of education that he has, as understanding it as not only about individual striving and individual efforts to kind of climb up a social ladder, but it's a shared project, because that's the way that it's modeled in the kind of at the foundation of his own experience going from student to teacher. And he carries that with him in terms of how he conceptualizes the ASNLH, as the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History.
Tessie McGee, personifies this kind of negotiation between insurgent Black study and the white gaze. And you mentioned throughout the book that, that Black fugitive pedagogues, pedagogues had to be aware of a certain kind of performance towards the white gaze, right? Which Woodson himself knew, even as he's kind of aiming these polemics at Black teachers, right? Mm-hmm. Including himself, obviously, in that critique, right? He understood the negotiations. Everything didn't seem exactly what it seemed. And there's a way in which, when we think about this moment, right, and there's no way really to read Carter G. Woodson as anything but a public scholar, a public intellectual, I think, in this moment. Talk a little bit about this negotiation between fugitive pedagogy and what we think of now as public scholarship, right? Are they mutually exclusive, or are there other negotiations that take place in order to do that kind of work, for lack of a better way to describe it, in plain sight?
Right. So I definitely don't think that they're unrelated, because Woodson is doing this. He makes a conscious decision to move outside of formal educational structures for the purposes of influencing the work that teachers are doing in classrooms, and to provide them with resources that they're not able to gain access to through traditional teacher training pathways, and in some instances, not even at the HEUs, right? Because Woodson himself is only able to teach. He leaves Howard University after teaching there for 1 year because of the conflicts with, the white president of the university, but also the manipulative practices of white philanthropists. And so he's trying to create a kind of an alternative kind of space for a counter public, really, for Black teachers to have space to engage in the kind of intellectual struggle and knowledge production that's necessary to see the kind of transformation that they're collectively striving for in the context of schools. And so his identity as a public intellectual is a part of that fugitive pedagogy, him trying to escape the control mechanisms of white philanthropy and white leadership of Black institutions and Black education, which he talks about explicitly in The Miseducation of the Negro in 1933, after he had been completely alienated from white philanthropists, that he had been trying to toe the line in terms of trying to appease them in ways that he could, but also still maintain intellectual autonomy with building the organization he's trying to create. And so by 1930, his public critiques of white philanthropists and his refusal to allow them to dictate the terms of the scholarship that he's writing creates a kind of a complete break between him and these white education reformers and kind of, racial liberals white racial liberals during that time period that he saw as essentially paternalistic and controlling and manipulative of the development of Black education. And so I see his model of public scholarship as an extension of that tradition of fugitive pedagogy. But he's still trying to partner with Black teachers to influence the lives of students that are continuously being cycled into schools. But he's saying some of the work that needs to be done and the resources that we need have to come from outside of this schooling apparatus of the state, right? And that's what we see him modeling. And I think that's a very important part of this history of fugitive pedagogy that's related to, but distinct from, the kind of individual act of subversively navigating power in the context of schools by secretly offering students this information, right? Woodson it's a part of this collective struggle, and those things are related. I do think that there are ways in which some of the elements of this tradition of fugitive pedagogy can be modeled in the contemporary moment. But to be clear, well, I was going to say, we don't live under the same kind of forms of kind of censorship and violence that we see with these kind of educators in the early 20th century. But, you know, I have to be like honest. I could not have anticipated what we're seeing currently when it comes to the
Critical race
legislative
theory,
campaigns. Exactly. I was, you know, which is quite resonant with this much longer history. And one of the things that that I have to tell my students is that what we see right now with these legislative campaigns to restrict how we teach about race and racial inequality in the and racial violence and inequality in the context of schools is much more consistent with the longer span of like the policing of the parameters of knowledge and our approaches to teaching knowledge in this country than what we might have seen within the last couple of decades that people have became somewhat comfortable with as the DEI kind of consulting industry expanded and kind of efforts around anti-racist teaching and stuff became taken up in popular discourse. I'm like, you know, what we see, this backlash is actually much more consistent with the longer history of education in this country. And we have to be mindful of that. We have to have a long memory of these things.
I love the idea, you know, two things again out of Woodson's career. One, his thought of the association with the study, associated with the study of Negro life and history as a free reference bureau. Really like an analog version of Black Twitter, you know, 90 years before Black Twitter. And also this idea of the abroad mentor, you know, which you reclaim from this idea of abroad marriages, you know, folks who were married across plantations. And I always remember early in my career talking with Robin D.G. Kelly, and he mentioned as an undergraduate student, he just sent a cold letter to Neal Painter because he didn't have mentors, right? And he, you know, knew she existed, knew she was a PhD in history, just simply sent her a letter and how she mentored him. You know, then in the absence of the internet, the absence of social media, but through just a letter writing campaign, right? And it's something that he then replicated in his own career. But again, you take this back to the role that Carter G. Woodson played, right? As mentoring, particularly, you know, Black secondary and K through 12 teachers, right? In a way that was extraordinary given the kind of limits of communication at the time.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that becomes the reason that I offer that language of a broad mentorship is because I wanted to couch this narrative of Woodson's effort to create these non-traditional pathways of kind of collaboration between Black scholars and Black teachers that moved beyond to traditional teacher training pathways as part of a longer legacy of Black people striving to create social relations that best suit the needs of their lives, right? And when we see these kind of non-traditional forms of kind of kinship and relationship that folks have always had to develop in order to, you know, to eke out an existence and to create experiences of kind of human dignity and opportunities for right relationship and meaningful study. And I wanted to place that tradition in the intellectual tradition, this a broad mentorship within that longer set of that broader conversation. And that was important because we see what, you know, Woodson himself, when he's a master's student at the University of Chicago, he wants to write his master's thesis on the Negro Church. There's no one at Chicago to assist him with doing this. What does he do? He turns and he writes a letter to W.B. Du Bois, who doesn't know who he is, right? So in 1908, before he's Dr. Woodson, right? He's just, you know, a student that's, you know, striving to get his master's at University of Chicago. He writes this letter to Du Bois. But we see how, you know, Black scholars are having to piece together the kind of mentorship and intellectual training that they need in order to create this new body of knowledge that they understand to be important. The Association for the Study of Negro Life and History serves a similar function. We see Woodson institutionalizing that practice by creating this intellectual public where, you know, Black scholars who are studying history, but not only just history, you have folklorists and, you know, Black folks who are studying other kind of sociological questions as well, and anthropology also attending the ASNLH meetings early on, because this is a space, this is really the first academic organization devoted to the study of race in this country, right? When we think about the mission of that organization and how it's setting out, and then creates a journal, the Journal of Negro History, to publish this information, and a space for them to publish this academic knowledge, and really asserts and says that the study of Black life and history is a legitimate field of study, right? And they're creating the parameters and the protocols for doing that. And then you have people like Charles H. Wesley, Rayford Logan, who come behind, and even someone like Zora Neale Hurston, right, who is working for the ASNLH. We think about that book Barracoon that she writes when she interviews, one of the last enslaved people who came through the Middle Passage in the U.S., right? She's working there on assignment from the ASNLH, right, and receiving funding to do that. And we have to understand this broad mentorship that Woodson is doing to kind of open up space for what later become, Black studies, obviously. But for me, that was just very important. Even people who felt like Woodson was difficult to get along with, they could not write him off, because they acknowledged and they respected the mission and his commitment to the mission of this kind of early Black studies movement that he's creating space for, and that they're all participating in and trying to expand. And that language of a broad mentorship for me was important to name that phenomenon in the Black intellectual tradition.
One of the things I'm curious about in reading this book, I wonder if you would share what it was about your own training that made you open and susceptible to the narrative that you write in Fugitive Pedagogy.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm trying to figure out what point to kind of emphasize. I should say that I didn't go to graduate school to study education at all, or study the history of Black education. I went to the PhD program in African American Studies at UC Berkeley for a very different set of questions that I was asking. But I read a book by Vanessa Siddle Walker called Their Highest Potential, which is a work of educational history, and it's about a high achieving Black school in Jim Crow, North Carolina, called the Coswell County Training School. I read that in the second semester of my graduate program, and I was so shocked to encounter such deep resonances between the educational culture she was writing about and the education I experienced in Compton, California in the 1990s up into the early 2000s, because I attended this small Black parochial school. It was formerly an all-white school when the city of Compton was all white. After the Watts uprising, you have white flight, Black folks move into the city and they appropriate this school. And it wasn't until I read that book that I realized that, all of the teachers that I had were Southern migrants who were educated in Jim Crow schools, a number of them having also been educated at HBCUs. And I think, just a short story, the principal of this school, who started teaching there in the 1970s, was still the principal when I got there in the 1990s, who was educated in the Crow schools of Lake Providence, Louisiana. She attends Southern University, begins teaching at the Southern Laboratory School at Southern University, and in many ways just works to recreate many of the educational practices that she understood to be good and meaningful in her own educational development, and to use that as a kind of a guide and resources for building this school that she developed and that she was the leader of in Compton that I attended. And we did such that reciting poems by Black poets every morning before starting class and singing the Black national anthem, right, at every program and at every morning devotion was a norm for me from the time I was in preschool up until the time I graduated from the 8th grade. And then I went to a high school that was also predominantly Black in Watts. Over 75% Black students, overwhelming majority of the teachers were Black. Many of them were also Southern migrants. One in particular, who was the chair of the English department, was educated at the Frederick Douglass School in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and began her education in the Jim Crow era before moving to California and attending Compton High School. And she began teaching during the Watts uprisings, right? And so many of the teachers that I encountered that gave me a meaningful education were operating in a tradition that was much longer than, my experience or their experience. And so that became kind of the early part of my own educational experience that I drew on as a resource when trying to recuperate and make these connections in addition to kind of going to UC Berkeley and, you know, realizing that Black studies is something that I wanted to do after having Eula Taylor who's a professor at UC Berkeley as the professor of my sophomore year, that made me realize that this is actually what I wanted to do, and really was really operating also in this tradition as well. And my undergraduate mentor and subsequently my dissertation advisor, right? So that language of a broad mentorship and this ongoing tradition and the relationship between Black teachers and Black study in the university is something that I knew intimately, and that I saw reflected as part of the best of the Black intellectual tradition and embodied in the story of teachers. And I wanted to bring all of that into the story that I told, and wrapping that around the life of Woodson to kind of open up new ways of understanding this history and that heritage.
We've been joined today by Professor Jarvis R. Givens, who's Assistant Professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a faculty affiliate in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. His wonderful new contribution to the field of Black study is Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, published by Harvard University Press 2021, of which our friend Henry Giroux describes as a brilliant, inspiring, and energizing book that reclaims the narratives of critique and hope that fueled the deep grammar of pedagogical struggle that unfolded in both the experiences and narratives of Black educators in the beginning of the 20th century and beyond. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Givens.
Thank you so much for having me.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every Black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All Black everything, everything Black, culture over everything.